Chernobyl explosion that shook the Soviet Union. When the USSR lost control. What happens when a sleepy Ukrainian night shift is handed the keys to a volatile nuclear reactor? Why did a test meant to prevent catastrophe unleash one of history's most radioactive meltdowns? How did this single explosion shake not just steel and atoms, but the very foundations of an empire? So, what really happened during those critical hours? Why were children marching in radiation masks beneath banners of Lenin? And how did the day the atoms went rogue help crack the Iron Curtain? The answers will astound you, and the fallout might just be emotional. In the early 1970s, Soviet engineers looked at a quiet patch of forest about 80 miles north of Kyiv, right on the Ukraine-Belarus border, and said, "Perfect. No nosy neighbors." Low population density meant fewer witnesses if things went kaboom, which in hindsight was quite the omen. Why here? Because the USSR, stretching like a bear on Yoga Day, had its people scattered far from the eastern energy supply. Nuclear power was the shiny new solution, less pollution than belching coal and more reliable than vodka-fueled generators. And so they built Chernobyl. Out of this radioactive romance bloomed Pripyat, a thriving town of 49,000 residents just a mile and a half from the power plant. Built as a utopian Soviet city, complete with amusement parks, murals glorifying nuclear energy, and yes, a clock that stopped forever on April 26, 1986. 6 nuclear reactors were planned. By 1983, 4 stood tall and 2 were still cooking in construction limbo. These weren't your run-of-the-mill reactors. Oh no, they were RBMK-1000s, Soviet-designed graphite-moderated beasts that used slightly enriched uranium-235 to sustain chain reactions. Like cats on a leash, these reactors were powerful but feisty. How they worked: steam was the muscle. Boiled water rushed up tubes to spin turbines. Coolant water flowing beneath fuel channels kept things chill. Safety features? Sure. Emergency cooling systems and 30 control rods to keep neutrons in check. But here's the kicker. The RBMK-1000 had what engineers called a positive void coefficient. In plain terms, if water boiled into steam too quickly, it stopped absorbing neutrons, which made the reaction go whoosh. More fission, more heat, more chaos. At high power, the reactor kept itself tame. But below 20% output, it became a volatile beast, prone to sudden surges, like a sleeping dragon stirred from its nap. The Chernobyl safety test was supposed to be a textbook procedure, scheduled and rehearsed for the day shift. These engineers had been briefed like elite dancers, prepping for a ballet of electrons. But just before they could hit play on the atomic choreography, another power station hiccuped and guzzled up the grid's attention. Delay. Enter the night shift. Picture a crew summoned like understudies to a Broadway play, except the script was written in Sanskrit, and the stage was the world's most temperamental reactor. No one gave them an updated manual, just a cranky boss and a glowing disaster waiting to happen. Unit 4 was scheduled for routine maintenance. So naturally, the engineers decided, let's also do a test to see if we can keep the turbines spinning long enough to power emergency systems in case of a blackout. Just in case something bad ever happened, which ironically was the exact test that caused something bad to happen. The plan? Lower power output. Disable automatic shutdown systems because they were too interfering. Simulate a power outage. Measure if leftover turbine energy could run the coolant pumps for 45 seconds. Harmless? Ha! The power was dropped too low, then clumsily ramped back up. Control rods were pulled out dangerously far. The reactor became unstable, like trying to balance a tiger on a toothpick. Then came the fatal step, inserting the control rods back in. But the RBMK had a design flaw. The tips of the rods were graphite, which caused a brief power spike before the rods could dampen the reaction. And on this cursed night, that spike was catastrophic. Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov strutted into the control room, high on caffeine and low on empathy. Sleep-deprived, arrogant, and one insult away from getting himself a Most Abusive Manager award, he barked orders like he was conducting war, not wattage. He loathed incompetence, especially when it was his own, and considered safety protocols as suggestions from lesser mortals. Under his watch, the test would proceed, and sanity would flee the building. Leonid Toptunov, just past midnight, found himself handed the nuclear steering wheel. A graduate of the Moscow Engineering Physics Institute, The Soviet version of MIT, he was brilliant but inexperienced, especially in reactor shutdowns. Think pilot trained to land planes, suddenly told to park a space shuttle. Within minutes, he saw the procedure go sideways. Steam pressure, power output, rod insertion, it all started looking like a symphony of chaos. His gut screamed, "Abort." But Dyatlov growled, "Continue." And so, the show rolled on. Now for the sciencey part, but don't worry, I'll keep it juicy. Mistake 1, shutting off the emergency core cooling system. Mistake 2, running the reactor at 30 megawatt instead of the required 1000 megawatt. Mistake 3, turning off automatic regulators. Mistake 4, reducing control rods to just 6 to 8 instead of 30 minimum. Mistake 5, increasing coolant flow, dropping steam pressure. Mistake 6, removing nearly all control rods just to maintain power. Mistake 7, feed water reduced, turbines slowed, cooling waned. Each action was a pebble that fell into a canyon. Together they created an avalanche. Suddenly, the reactor surged with a force estimated at 100 times normal power output. Heat skyrocketed, fuel rods ruptured. Hot uranium particles turned water into steam faster than Dyatlov could curse. Boom! Steam explosion number 1 tore through the core like a titan's punch. 2 to 3 seconds later, boom again. Possibly from hydrogen gas buildup. Debris shot into the sky, radioactive confetti celebrating the USSR's worst engineering oversight. By 1:28 a.m., 14 brave firefighters arrived in basic gear, canvas coats, no radiation protection, and buckets of bravery. By 4 a.m., over 100 more joined, dancing with flames fueled by graphite and diesel. The graphite fire was particularly evil, spewing fission fragments into the stratosphere. The smoke and radiation rose half a mile into the air, singing an atmospheric opera no one wanted to hear. This toxic concert continued for 20 days, with emissions only easing after day 10. Final radiation released? A heart-melting 50 million curies, about 500 Hiroshima bombs of radioactive horror. Chernobyl wasn't the USSR's first misstep. In 1982, radiation leaked and was quietly swept under the bureaucratic rug. In 1983, top officials flagged the plant as hazardous. In 1984, more emergencies popped up like cursed toast. But the official line? Prevent panic and provocation rumors. Spoiler alert, the truth eventually leaked more aggressively than the reactor. Born in 1931, Mikhail Gorbachev was the general secretary and poster child of Soviet reform. Brilliant, yes. Bureaucratically cautious? Also yes. At 5 a.m. on April 26th, he got a call. There's been a reactor issue. His response? Meh. Quote, in the first hours and even the first day after the accident, there was no understanding that the reactor had exploded. He didn't wake his leadership team. No emergency session, just a commission. Because why panic when atoms are just misbehaving? Sherbina arrived at 8 p.m. and realized no one was running the show. He had the charisma of a bulldozer and started planning immediate containment. Water? No good. It would explode. Solution? Sand. Cue helicopters. Cue chemical units. Cue desperation. Regulations from 1963 claimed that evacuation wasn't necessary unless exposure hit 1 Roentgen. Radiation was rising from 40 to 320 microroentgens sec, about 1.2 Roentgen hour. Aman Abajian pushed for evacuation. But Evgeny Vorobiev, the commission's top medical officer, resisted. Meanwhile, people saw soldiers with gas masks, and kids were sent home with iodine pills. No panic, they said, while radioactive dust coated breakfast cereal. Finally, Abajian and other scientists convinced Sherbina to get Premier Nikolai Ryzhkov on the line. With his approval, Pripyat was evacuated in 2.5 hours on April 27th. But 5,000 workers remained. Some elders refused to leave, believing they'd be back in 3 days. Spoiler, they weren't. Evacuees left with radiation clinging to their clothes, bodies, and belongings. The KGB tried to suppress rumors, but when 1,000 people fled to nearby villages, the truth began global march. The day after the explosion, 26 people were hospitalized with acute radiation sickness. But wait, what about the heroic buses that whisked Pripyat's panicked families to safety? Oh, those valiant vehicles were quickly rerouted back to their regular duties in Kiev, a city of 2 million. The problem? They hadn't been decontaminated. So every bump on those bumpy seats radiated not just comfort, but literal radioactivity. It was like sending your grandma a bouquet of flowers with a side of isotopes. glowing ones. Meanwhile, the party leadership had a bigger priority than contamination: May Day, that glorious display of socialist strength, complete with giant Lenin portraits and balloon-waving children. Even as radiation levels ticked up, canceling the parade would have meant admitting weakness. So, while invisible particles danced through the Kiev air, school children marched in shorts and smiles. Slogans called for unity, while Geiger counters whispered doom. It was possibly the only parade in history where the confetti could have given you cancer. After the parade, hundreds of thousands of children were evacuated from high-risk zones. But unlike Pripyat, many were allowed to return in the fall. Because the party logic was simple: if they weren't glowing, they were going. No long-term monitoring, no strict quarantines, just a shrug and a train ticket home. The world heard nothing from the USSR until April 28th, when nuclear technicians in Stockholm scratched their heads over the sudden spike in radiation and called the Kremlin asking, guys, are you melting down, or? Cornered, the USSR finally issued a 15-second state broadcast admitting an incident. But don't worry, it was immediately followed by a list of nuclear mishaps in the West, like 3 Mile Island. Because why explain when you can deflect? Gorbachev's grand vision of glasnost, transparency, honesty, the dawn of a modern Soviet press, was about to be thrown into radioactive rubble. Chernobyl was the first real test of this policy, and it failed spectacularly. The government tried to suppress news, squash rumors, and dodge accountability, but the fallout wasn't just radioactive, it was political. Global trust evaporated, internal cynicism soared. Foreign media outpaced Soviet broadcasts in explaining what had happened in Soviet cities. Enter Vitaly Koratich, sharp-witted and bold, who took the helm of Ogonyok, a weekly publication that started digging for truth. With a circulation of 1.5 million, it began questioning the cover-ups and echoing reform. Moscow news followed suit. Suddenly, once loyal outlets were becoming instruments of public awareness. Gorbachev's restructuring plans got airtime, then scrutiny, then momentum. The media couldn't be shoved back into a box. Once people knew their government had lied about something as deadly as nuclear radiation, they began asking what else had been hidden. The Soviet regime had built itself on walls of secrecy. Chernobyl cracked that wall. Truth flowed through, and trust drained out. Within 5 years, the USSR would be no more. Hey, before you vanish like radiation into the stratosphere, don't forget to follow our channel, subscribe, and smash that notification bell so you never miss another dose of history's most thrilling, untold stories. Whether it's atomic secrets, political dramas, or eerie echoes from forgotten towns, we've got plenty more where this came from. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay with us.